Hi, welcome to these quick tour vodcasts through parts of Module 29. All right, the first vodcast will be focused on contextualizing what Module 29 is really trying to get us to think about. And primarily when Pavlov and Skinner and their disciples, so to speak, were doing their early work on cognitive and operant conditioning, they made certain assumptions about how associative learning happened. They were correct. I don't want you to think that this module is trying to show that they were completely incorrect. It was just that they made certain assumptions and there were other factors in addition to simple associations that were influencing the learning. So this doesn't undermine their work completely. Okay? There are certain aspects that will get undermined. Certain little features will get undermined, but not their project in its totality. Okay? All right, so what did they fail to consider in terms of how organisms learn associatively, right? That includes both cognitive, classical, and operant. Well, they did not take seriously enough the role of biology, biological differences between organisms, right? The other thing they did not take into consideration at all, because remember, you can't see it, and if you can't see it and observe it, then it's not science. They did not take into consideration cognition. And cognition does play a role in both classical and operant conditioning. So let's take a look at cognitive learning, which the behaviorist would have just said, no, it does not happen. Okay, so Pavlov. So we're in the world of classical conditioning. So one of the assumptions Pavlov made was right here. You know, conditioning occurs whenever a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus are paired. He also, another assumption number 2, any neutral stimulus could become a conditioned stimulus. Okay, now people started asking Pavlov and his followers, well, how exactly does classical conditioning work? We know that it does, but how does it work if you're not going to take into consideration cognition? So Pavlov's first stab was stimulus replacement. You know, we ring a bell, we present food, we ring a bell, we present food. Eventually the dog will salivate just to the bell. So his first stab at it was, well, the bell just simply replaces the food. It's stamped into the organism. There's no thinking, it's just simply an association. Then the Pavlovians thought, oh, maybe it's just a little bit more than just replacement. Maybe it has to do with timing. So it's still a mindless mechanism of two stimuli, this one and this one, paired together in time, where this one, for the best type of learning to happen, occurs before the unconditioned stimulus. Right? So that was what Pavlov assumed, right? So he went from this one to this assumption. And this assumption is called the contiguity model of classical conditioning. All right, enter Robert Rescorla and some of his followers and his researchers. Rescorla started, here's the basis of Rescorla. Rescorla basically is using cognitive learning to understand a behavioral process. So again, the Pavlovians would have really disliked this. So he basically said, well, all right, yeah, we get a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. We pair them together. He says, but it's about it's about the role the conditioned stimulus plays. The conditioned stimulus is actually a stimulus that helps the organism predict. It helps the organism expect. It contains information. And whenever we're talking about expectancy, predictability, or informativeness, he made up a word there, by the way, we're talking about cognition. We're not just simply talking about associations being stamped into place. We're inferring. You can't see it, but we're inferring. So think about this as more like cause and effect. So the conditioned stimulus predicts, the bell predicts the food. That's what he's trying to say. It learns what to expect. All right, sounds simple, right? Okay, so Rescorla and a guy named Leon Kamen, they did experiments. And remember second-order conditioning? And it does work. This is not undermining second-order conditioning. It does not always work. So here's an example of some research done using Rescorla's ideas of expectancy or predictability, right? We have a conditioned stimulus an unconditioned stimulus, right? And we have our response, right? The unconditioned response to shock is to being electrocuted is fear, right? And you keep pairing these two together. Eventually, the tone will result in fear, and the fear then would be a conditioned response. What Rescorla and fellow researchers figured out is during the acquisition stage, when you were doing tone and shock, during acquisition, the rat started shaking and showing fear when the tone was presented right before the shock, right? So acquisition is happening, correct? Right? The onset of learning. So he was like, man, the rat is getting fearful of the tone. It's starting to learn that the tone is going to predict. It's as if like cause and effect. So what they then do is they're like, okay, well, what if we put light, then tone, and then shock together, right? Shouldn't the rat eventually, during the stages of acquisition, shouldn't they show the fear response to the light? Because the light will predict the tone, and the tone predicts the shock. They did not actually develop a fear response to the light. They never did. They never started quivering or shaking. And Rescorla and his associates inferred that the light does not add any new information, because the light never by itself preceded the shock. The light always preceded the tone, and the tone always preceded the shock. So for the rats, all they needed to figure out that the shock was coming was the tone. The light gave no new information. So if you want an example of how this might work in real life, this is not a great example. I'm not trying to diss dogs here, right? They're very gentle most of the time. But let's just say we got this brown dog named Fanny, and she's a cutie, right? And then we got this border collie, white and black looking really cute dog named Toby. Okay, so when Fanny growls, she sometimes bites. Toby growls only before biting. This sounds like some kind of logic problem, right? What would Rescorla predict would happen? Okay. So your conditioned fear response to Fanny's growling will probably occur slowly because her growl does not always reliably signal the danger of a bite. But you are likely to quickly develop a fear response to Toby's bite. And the reason why is predictability and informationness. Toby's growl has information that is very relevant for you to know. If Toby starts growling, you better move your hand, right? That is cognition. So the key role here is that cognition in the form of predictability or expectancy plays a role in classical conditioning. Hence, Pavlov was limited in his understanding of what was going on with classical conditioning.